Welcome to part 4 in this Area Recordings Logic tutorial series. In this edition we're going to be looking at some very basic synthesis. In this case we're going to be looking at basic subtractive synthesis using Logic's ES1 synth. So call up an ES1. Set to its default patch, and I'm going to open up a tuner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through the different aspects of the synth, and then we'll look at creating a couple of basic sounds to fit in with this track that I'm working on. So as with any synthesizer, they've all got a flow to them. So starting at the beginning, we're going to work through, look at each part of the synth and have a brief explanation of what it does. So starting at the beginning, we have this selection of numbers which basically allow you to transpose the pitch of the synth. So what I'm going to do, if you check down here, you can see that I'm playing key C3 on my controller keyboard. And then we can see that this is set to number 4, the second button down. And the tuner is showing the pitch, or the note, if you will, of what's coming out. So we can see that this is currently set up, and by pressing C3 it's playing back an octave lower. So if I put this on number 2, I can see my C3 note is the same as the pitch of the sound coming out. C2 is my C2. So this would be the first kind of stage of starting to highlight how you want your sound to sound. Do you want a high sound? Do you want a low sound? You can do exactly the same thing by just moving your hand down the different octaves on the keyboard. But if you haven't got a full-size keyboard, or you've only got like a 32 key keyboard or something, it's good for just being able to change the sounds quickly. So I'm going to leave it the way it was set up by default, and then I'm going to look at the first stage of the sound being created, which is my oscillators. So the oscillators are the sound source of the synthesizer. So looking at this, I've got what I would say is oscillator number 1, my main oscillator. And then I've got what I would consider oscillator number 2. So in this case, oscillator number 2 is called the sub-oscillator. So for now, we're going to turn that off, and we're just going to listen to oscillator number 1. So the first waveform we've got is a sawtooth. So you can now see that by turning the sub-oscillator off, that the pitch has changed. So I've reset this, slowly working my way through. So I want a nice deep sound. So that's the sawtooth wave, and then next we've got a triangular wave. So you can hear that the sawtooth has got quite a dull sound. The triangular wave is quite bright. And then the next wave we've got on here is the square wave. So it sounds a little bit like a combination of the triangle and the sawtooth. listen closely when you're doing this, you can hear that there's lots of things that are going on within the sound. So even with a pure tone, there's lots of little things that your ears pick up. So the next waveform that we have is this here, which is a pulse width. It's basically a square wave, but if you look at the symbols, you can see that that's got a smaller box and a larger square, while this has got equal squares. Basically what happens as you move this round to varying degrees, that this is moving backwards and forwards, starting off slowly and getting faster. Again, it's quite subtle. Listen carefully, you'll be able to hear the difference, something for you to experiment with. So it gives it kind of a phasing effect the quicker that it modulates. So what we're going to look at now is our oscillator number 2, or our sub-oscillator. This section here, entitled Mix, is more or less a volume control. It allows you to have 100% oscillator number 1, or 100% oscillator number 2, or a mix between the two. So it acts as like a crossfader on a DJ mixer, really. So going down all the way to the sub, you can hear there's no sound playing at all. We've now bypassed this by effectively turning the volume of it off. So we've got this off position here with no sound, and then our first wave is a variation of the pulse width. You can hear and see that this is playing 1 octave lower than oscillator number 1, hence it being a sub-oscillator. The second variation of the pulse width here is playing 2 octaves below oscillator number 1. Next up we have just a basic square wave. Again, playing 2 octaves lower than this. And then we have another variation of the pulse width. Again, playing 2 octaves below oscillator number 1. And then we have another pulse width, which is playing 1 octave below oscillator number 1. So we've got a selection of waveforms that play at different octaves below the main waveform. The next one we have is EXT, which stands for external. So by using the sidechain function up here, you can play sounds through the synth and use the synth functions to treat the incoming sound source. It's not something that I've ever had much occasion to use personally, but it's worth having an experiment with and messing about with. You might find something useful. And then lastly we have this here, which is white noise. So what I'm going to do, so I want quite a punchy sound, so I've got a fairly dull sound but with quite a sharp punch to it on oscillator number 1, and then oscillator number 2 just got more of a punchy kind of bass sound, obviously because it's a lower octave. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to find a position in the middle. can see by how I'm moving the mix button that the change is really subtle. So clearly having it in the middle, you get an equal amount of each, but just moving it a fraction either side really affects the sound that's coming through. So moving on, the next section we have is a drive section, and this basically is just an overdrive. So as the oscillators pass through, before they get to the filter section, you can use the drive to beef up the sound a little bit. So if I turn the drive to 0, so there's no drive effect on the waveforms, and then I'm just going to slowly turn it up. Again, it's very subtle what's happening. You can hear in the higher harmonics that there's like a pressure building. It's very subtle. So it's just filled out the sound a little bit. It's made it a little bit more beefy. So moving on to the filter now. We've got 4 different filter types, and each of these are modelled on classic filters. So we've got 24 dB classic, which is modelled on a Moog filter. We've got 24 dB fat, which is based on an Oberheim filter. We have 18 dB, which is based on the filter on the Roland 303, and then a 12 dB filter, which is based on another Oberheim filter. So these numbers and the decibels really on their own like that don't really mean very much. So to kind of highlight what these filters actually mean, I'll use an EQ. So on the basic channel EQ, you've got at the bottom your filter, and at the top another filter. So you've got your high pass and your low pass. The ES1 has only got low pass filters. So I'm going to switch my low pass filter on and drag it down, do it to 500. I'm not using it, we're just looking at this slope for demonstration. The filters, different filters have a slightly different sound to one another, but what the numbers generally stand for is this slope. So the higher value, the steeper the slope. So this is set to 12 decibels, so that's what 12 dB slope looks like. So if we move it to 18, so the difference between 12 and 18 is quite severe. It's blocking off a lot of the high end that's trying to go through. And as we go down to 24, it just gets steeper and it's just cutting more of the sound off. So the higher the value, the steeper the slope. So to demonstrate that, what I'll do is I'll just play the key and just open the filter fully, stick it on 24 dB classic, which is the Moog filter. It's quite nice sounding. If we go to 24 dB fat, which is the Oberheim filter. So the 24 dB fat is just a brighter filter. It's not cutting so much of the high frequencies away. So the 18 dB, which is a slightly smaller slope based on the 303 filter. It's got a lighter sound to it. It's not affecting the sound as much as these ones. It's not giving it as thick a sound. It's giving it a much lighter sound. And then if we put the 12 dB filter on, which is the other Oberheim, so there's not much difference between those two. So if we drop it to halfway, so with the lower slope, it's not as noticeable until you get down to the lower frequencies. So once you've chopped a lot of the high end off, you can notice the difference between how much the slope is affecting the high frequencies within the sound. So the 12 dB has still got a little bit of brightness there. And then the next stage of the filter is the resonance. So using the channel EQ again, if you imagine that's your filter, so you've just cut here to say 200. What the resonance does, I should say, is it boosts that point right at the end of the cutoff, or it just deadens it a little bit. So it can add brightness or it can increase the dullness of the sound. So if we put it halfway, so you can hear that it's adding a bit like an exciter does. It's adding to the high frequencies. It's putting more content in there and boosting it. So the next step as we move along is the key, and this pretty much affects how much filter is played as you move up the keyboard. So if you have it set to 0, you get the same amount of filter cut off on every key, and then as you move up, you should notice that you get the filter opens wider the higher up the keyboard you go. Again, something to explore, something to experiment with. Generally I've set that to 0. It's not something I really use very much. So we've got the starting point of choosing which octave we want to work in. We've got our sound sources, our main high frequency sound and our sub sound. We've got our mix that lets us select the volume of each and blend them together. We've got our overdrive section that lets us drive the oscillators before they go into the filter. We've got our different filter settings. In this case, they're modelled on some classic synths. And then we've got the cutoff, which allows us to select how much of the frequency spectrum is playing by removing from the top end. It's a low pass filter. It only has low pass on the ES1. Then we have our resonance to help us bring out some of the higher frequencies in this case, or to kind of boost some of the lower frequencies. Then we've got the key that dictates how the cutoff reacts when we press the different keys on the keyboard. Then we have this section here, which is the ADSR via velocity. So this allows you to select how the filter reacts based on how hard you hit the keys. So as I'm pressing the key harder and quieter, you can hear the different effect that the filter's having. It's using the ADSR to control the filter, the same way as ADSR works in general. But it also allows you to select how wide your bandwidth is. So the harder the keys pressed, the wider the filter opens up and gives you a different effect. In this case, you get like a 303 kind of acid effect. I'm only pressing the key randomly. If you were to program that, you get a nice sound out of it. And then here, the next stage is we have our amplifier. This is more or less a volume control that lets you select what the quietest volume is going to be and what the highest is. So by using the velocity, it reacts to that again. So if we put it on full, the filter's reacting to the velocity as I'm pressing the key, but the volume is consistent because there's not a low volume. It's just the volume's been set to play the loudest it will, as set by this. Where if I open it up, I get a variation in the level of the sound as well. Again, play about with it, experiment. And then the final part of this top section is you're selecting how your ADSR is going to work, or your amp envelope, which is here. By selecting a gate R, you've enabled the attack and the release, and the decay and sustain have been bypassed. By selecting ADSR in the middle, everything is working as normal. And then if you select gate R, everything is bypassed apart from the release. So the ADSR at the bottom here, you've got your standard attack, decay, sustain, release. again, it's just a matter of tweaking it, see how you want your sound to come out. And then the next stage is the LFO and the mod envelope, and in between that you've got your router. So this side is your LFO, this side is your mod envelope, and basically you just select which section of the synth you want the LFO to modulate. So in this case I'll pick the cutoff, and then by selecting how much I want it to modulate by, this it's like the bandwidth, the same as this really. So when the bottom section here is moved up, it sounds like it's having a greater effect, but all it's actually doing is it's just modulating a smaller part of the sound. So by moving it down, it's only affecting the lower portion of the sound, which is not as audible. And then the top end is the higher part of the sound, which is what you can hear easily. And then this lets you select your rate. And then this lets you select the waveform that you want it to modulate by. So it's quite good for hearing how the different waveforms sound. You've got the sawtooth, you can hear that the sound is moving up and down, fairly consistent. You've got a reverse triangle, so you can hear that the sound peaks quite quickly and then drops before peaking again. You've got a standard triangle, where you can hear the sound rise and then fall. Then you've got a square wave, and then I've got a square sine combination and a sine. So I'm going to go for a sawtooth. And then this bit with the mod envelope, again the principles are exactly the same as over here. You select the portion that you want to modulate, and then you select how quick you want it to come in, or how slow you want it to come in. And then you've got your ADSR, as explained earlier. That was quite a poor explanation of that. I do apologise. And then as we move on, we've got our tuning, so you can fine tune your synth or detune your synth. You've got your analog, which makes the synth react virtually like it would be an analog synth. So you get fluctuations in the pitch and the tone. The more that the higher you have the percentage, the more change you get. It's one of the classic things about using analog gear, especially something like a Moog or a Prophet 5, is they're quite renowned for going out of tune, and so every time they use have to be retuned. Then you've got your bender, which applies to your pitch knob on your controller keyboard, how wide you want your range. And then we've got a master output level. Here it's set to -3. Then we've got the amount of voices that we can use. So to have it as a true kind of mono synth, set it to 1 voice. Generally most things are set to 16 voices. It's a fairly standard thing. And then you've got your effect. So this synth has got 2 types of chorus and an ensemble. So if we just listen to it with those on. You can hear it being modulated a little bit more, the sound thickened up. So the next step to do really is to listen to the track that you're building and then tweak your patch to fit with your song. So I've got the beat and the organ that I put in the last tutorial. So what I've gone in and done is I have applied a delay to the organ sample, a delay to my reverse cymbal, and a delay to my hi-hats. So I'll bypass those. So now I'm going to tweak this synth and get it to fit in with my track that's playing. So what I've just done is I've just gone in and changed the velocity so everything's playing at the same velocity. Just in case you're wondering what I was just flicking about doing. And then I'm just going to... So it's not brilliant. It is just a quick tutorial, very basic, as I said all along. But that's the beginning of building the track up. What I'll do now is I'll quickly zip back into another ES1 and I'll look for a slightly higher sound to put in. But what I'll do with this one to give it a little bit more life is I'll put a few effects on it. So what I'll do is I'll put some EQ on it. I'll take out the bottom end so it's not clashing with anything else that's in there. I'll apply some delay, just some little standard type delay. I'll just chuck a little bit of reverb on there. So again, I've only tweaked the sound a little bit. That will do. So just through those few little tweaks on the synth, I've got a bass line to fit over the top of my organ, which I'll get rid of some of the bottom end of that off. Stop them clashing. And I've just got myself just a little effect that I can drop at the end of a section to kind of bring the next section in, or before a drop or something. And then the next stage would be to look at this little bit that I've got now and start constructing that into some kind of song, and thinking about my structure that I've got here. And the next tutorial that I'm going to do is going to be about MIDI editing, some more stuff about quantization, and generally just building the song up. So between now and the next tutorial video, there should be a little bit more of a song there for you to check out. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Leave me some feedback. Goodbye.